15 years, cannabis specific, almost 14 years now. I managed the greenhouse company for 11 years, and I've just been doing advising and consulting the last 3. I spent a lot of time up in Humboldt. I moved here in 1992 when I was 18 years old, so I've spent some time up here. I live in Grass Valley now, and that's where I manage the greenhouse company. And so over the course of time, in my greenhouse career, I started realizing that there was a few stumbling blocks we were running into. Greenhouses are made for the winter time, but everybody in Humboldt at the time, or in cannabis, wanted to use them in the summer. And they took the winters off. And so here we have this contraption that's made for the winter time, but everybody wants to use it in the summer. And you actually can run into a lot of greenhouses throughout Humboldt, hoop houses like these, that people will rip the plastic off. They don't even use it because they realized that something wasn't going right, maybe. And the cannabis they grew outdoors in the full sun was much easier and grew better than in a greenhouse at times. And so really the concept was that, the greenhouse's ventilation was one of them, but the greenhouse covers were the other. So you can see right now that the greenhouse is opened up really well, the sides are open, but we still have a lot of exposure coming through the greenhouse plastic right now. And that's a good thing in the winter time, but it starts to get a little bit more troublesome as we get into the summer, right? The idea for the greenhouse covers is to get the exposure to the plants so that they heat them up, even to get to the soil, so we heat the soil up in the winter time so that we can actually grow things. But as we get into the summer, we want to start to cool everything down. And how do we do that? Well, a lot of people will say, I just put fans in the greenhouse. Fans cost money because the electricity that needs to be running all the time. And in California, it's pretty easy for PG&E to shut off our power, and then we have a catastrophic event. And so you have to have a backup generator a lot of times for your greenhouse so that if there is a power outage, we can deal with it. So then we get into the idea that there also is natural ventilation, passive ventilation, which what we see here. The sides are rolled up and the ends are open, and that's great. We actually start to take away the greenhouse effect, but we still have that exposure coming down. Today, not necessarily causing a problem for growing, but it's a little bit more of an experience for us because we're in shoes and socks, hats. When we're working, we might even be in gloves and some kind of a overcoat or lab coat or something like that, depending on where you are. And so it can get really hot for us. It's much different for the plants. And a lot of times with greenhouses, we have a sensor that hangs in the middle of the greenhouse that tells us the temp and the humidity, which is great. But it doesn't tell us the actual plant temp or the surface temp, let's say, of our containers and things like that. And so one of my favorite tools to use in the greenhouse happens to be this infrared thermometer. And so what I try to do is I point and shoot the plants, the pots, the ground, everything to kind of get a collective idea of what the surface temps are. I can't really control what the air temp is, but I can kind of work on the plant temp and the surfaces. And how do I do that? Well, I do it through the different greenhouse covers. And so a summertime greenhouse, in my opinion, would be best used as a polywoven material. Not necessarily the checkerboard reinforced films. I don't have a sample of that with me, it's in my car, but a reinforced film is almost like checkerboard strings going through it. And a lot of people in their interpretation of things will say it's a diffused greenhouse cover. It is to some extent, but not much. A lot of times these things will transmit 90% light and only diffuse it by 30%. And the diffusion might be the shade that we're seeing, the difference from the full sun to the shading. And so when we get into the polywoven materials, they're more of an 85% transmission, but a higher diffusion, up to 100%. And the difference is the spreading of the light. And so a lot of times when we look at, like here's an example. When we look at indoor lighting, the old lights before LEDs, it wasn't there was a bunch of different bulbs. There was a bunch of different hoods and reflectors for spreading the light because we get hot spots on the plants. Ununiform spread, so everybody worked on the reflector game back in the day. They still do for that matter, but it's not as much as it used to be with the LEDs. And so basically the way I look at it is the sun is the light bulb, and we got to put the right reflector on our greenhouse to give us our best results of our plants. So in the summertime, we learned this from off the grid, especially in Humboldt, in the Emerald Triangle. In 2006 and 2007, we started pushing greenhouses that had these covers, and they opened on the roof and the walls, and they were real fancy. But as the economy was really taking a shit those years, even cannabis farmers were tightening their belt, and nobody was really buying fancy automated greenhouses, even though that was the goal. We started looking at hoops again and pulling tarps, and still to this day, people are doing that. And so by using the proper greenhouse cover in the summertime, more diffusion, we're spreading more light, so we're calming down the sun's intensity. But the manufacturers will even tell you that their diffusion means for greenhouse covers, we're splitting light particles in half and we're scattering infrared. Infrared's what brings the heat. And so how do we quantify all that stuff when we start waving this thing around? And to actually create what I like to call a supportive environment, because everybody looks at greenhouses and goes, it's a controlled environment. It's really more the supportive environment, especially when we're coming from a regenerative ag, off the grid, you know, trying to save money in general and not run fans all the time. We're looking at natural ventilation, the proper greenhouse cover, maybe even, you know, hugelkultur beds if we want to go deep into the region, but if you're not, people will put ground cover down. If you notice the black ground cover sitting out here that was originally down here, it killed the weeds and it didn't breathe, and the black, let's just for instance, oh, my battery, right when I need it, my battery's dying. Oh, you're killing me. No, you gotta be shitting me. Okay, so I need new batteries. I was taking heat samples before I was about to talk. So the ground was 82 degrees, 91 in the sun, and if I was to hit the black out there, I guarantee you it's in the hundreds. It's probably 120 in the black. And so if you think about our containers that we use, the black plastic containers, even the smart pots and things like that, or black fabric pots, encourage more heat, so we can actually, you know, work smarter in the wintertime by putting black down, black pots, clear cover, encourage that free solar gain that we need to get that heat going. But in the summertime, we want the opposite. So we're looking at white ground cover, tan grow bags versus black, diffused greenhouse cover, and then opening up the greenhouse like we see here. The sides are up, the ends are open. For me, to make the greenhouse really work the best in the summertime and not have any solar gain and avoid the chance of some of this condensation that we see, because as plant temps increase, we start to have plants that transpire, right? That's how they cool themselves down. We perspire, plants transpire. So condensation is a result in the summertime of plant sweat. That's why people can be fearful of pulling their depth tarps at 5:30 in the evening, because the condensation pours in. Outdoor people really don't want to pull their tarps at 5:30 in the evening. And the reason I say that is because we like to tarp early and take them off as soon as we can, as soon as it's dark, and let them breathe all night. But that condensation factor freaks everyone out, and usually it can be alleviated even just by changing this greenhouse cover and then opening these doors all the way to the top. Because if you think about it, greenhouses, you know, were made for wintertime. Solar gain is the name of the game for the wintertime, but in the summer it's not. And so by having this right here, we have a little bit of solar gain. The cannabis plants know that as they start to grow into this, what happens is heat tries to find its way down and out. It grows and finds its way out the sidewalls or out these doors. So by opening it all the way, we take away the greenhouse effect. Hoop houses can't have the nice ridge vent at the top like the nice Gothic or A-frame greenhouses can. And so without the ability to have that ridge vent, the hoop houses really need to be opened up. And so it can make it difficult for depth, because sometimes people are trying to pull big tarps. They black out the end walls permanently. Unfortunately, the exterior depth systems really kind of make it tough, because you have no choice sometimes but to have these ends with even a 7-foot door. A 7-foot door with a 6-foot roll-up sidewall. You got a hot box up above my head right here all summer long. And turning on fans while the sides are rolled up isn't going to do shit, because we broke the seal of negative pressure. In order to have fans make air exchange, we have to shut the greenhouse down. The only way for the air to come in is through louvers at that end. It travels through and out the other side. And so we can avoid the solar gain by mechanical ventilation, but it has to be one air exchange per minute, moving some air. If we start to roll up the sides, we diminish that negative pressure. Therefore, the fans aren't going to exchange the air. Now we have solar gain. I have people that tell me, well, it's 75 degrees coming in, and by the time it travels through the greenhouse and out the other side, it's up to 130 degrees. And so that's not good. And so the idea would be then, okay, maybe we should go more natural ventilation, supportive environment rather than controlled environment. Because the controlled environment in some cases with certain greenhouses could be futile. And if you think about what cooling systems are for greenhouses being a wet wall, they might work okay in southern Humboldt, but they're not going to work in northern Humboldt. and they definitely don't work in other states. Try to go to Oklahoma and use a wet wall. It's not going to happen. And so some of these natural ventilation, greenhouse covers, and all this shit I've been preaching for almost 13 years now really is important, because we can't do all the same things that we see people doing on Instagram. And to be honest with you, the fancier the greenhouse doesn't make fancier weed. You know, it makes fancier holes in the ground to dig yourself into, and you got to claw your way out of. But at the end of the day, like I was saying, the greenhouse cover is really your best friend to all this, because even if it was a hot summer day right now, if it was 100 degrees, plant temps are going to exceed those air temps even with it opened up like this, just because of this greenhouse cover. And what happens when plant temps exceed the air temp? It's almost like an air conditioner that condenses. Those buds are trying to sweat. They're so fat that there's nowhere for that moisture to escape. And of course they're going to bud rot. You know, of course it's going to be mold, because the moisture has nowhere to go once you're starting to get towards the finish line. And so by calming down the sun's intensity, we can do that. Add some circulation fans in here to move some air around. We can get 3 to 5 degrees cooler on plant temps just from moving the air around. If Mother Nature isn't providing enough. You know, maybe Mother Nature is blowing enough air and you don't need the circulation fans, but it can get pretty dead and stagnant in here sometimes if we don't have a little bit of air movement, especially in the corners. And when it comes to these light depth end walls that some of these companies force us into, you know, if we can make the doors go all the way to the ceiling and open, but then you have the arms on the outside for those depth systems, you know, maybe we can extend them out or something like that. Maybe the door can just come off in the summertime. I mean, really, once it's summer, we're not extending the season, we're not closing the sides, and, you know, for depth we are, but not for the rest of the greenhouse. And so we kind of need to look at it 2 different ways. The greenhouses run like different animals in the winter than they do in the summer. And a lot of this stuff that we see up here in black ground cover is winter tech, or winter mode I call it, versus summer mode. Now if you wanted to maybe use a shade cloth, and a lot of people do, it's another form of diffusion because it's scattering infrared, but it's restricting light. And in some cases that can be okay because we get so much sun in those heat waves. But the shade cloth isn't the same as it used to be. They call them climate screens. And climate screens are a little bit different than your general shade cloth that is a black mesh. Remember the color black being with the heat gun more absorbing, so if you start to have a greenhouse with black shade cloth, black ground cover, and black grow bags, you know you're kind of in for it. It's like a solar oven. So we want to do opposite of all that, and so a lot of people don't necessarily want to do a greenhouse cover. They do just straight shade cloth all summer. Great, I'd recommend going with a climate screen. These white lines right here, or white strips that go through here, can be spaced out differently. So a 30% shade cloth might be one strip with a gap and another white strip. This is like a 40%. It's got 2 next to each other, skipped to a single and then a double. And so depending on how they make these climate screens will give you your different amounts of shading, but notice the color being white and reflective. It's more reflective, right? And so what we're doing is different than a lot of the other farmers out there. We're growing terps and cannabinoids, not just plants. And I know when we're growing a tomato or a grape and some of these things, we want the sugars and them to be sweet and things like that. But again, it's a little bit different as we get to maturity and the sun's really beating on us in July. Maybe we're getting close to our first round. We're really looking for good terps and cannabinoids, and we don't want to zap them off during that heat wave. So some of these things that I've been talking about and show you really help with those expressions. We've seen terpene companies that really like, you know, processing that type of material. Some of the labs have even said what's going on. We see higher terps and cannabinoids in some of this greenhouse stuff than we do in the outdoor or the indoor. But it really boils down to the supportive environment, not the controlled environment. That's what we really need to look at. And you can have, you know, a fancy greenhouse, so controlled environment, if we want to call it that, but you still have to have supportive attributes to the plant. The plant's still the plant. It's still the same, and everybody tries to, I don't know, make up something different along the way. And so I won't hold you guys here too long because I know Joey's got to keep his schedule going. I do have some other things that I can talk about as far as ionized water, but I do have the machine back there, and you can come back, a little table where we're smoking, hang out. You know, the main thing that I think everybody should kind of look at is that, you know, the world out there right now is kind of trying to say sun-grown is gone, and some of these, you know, weird phrases that are going around, and I wouldn't let that deter you from what you're doing. What I would say is that you might want to incorporate a little depth in there. You know, I know that there are people and farms that I've talked to that are like, look, I'm looking at doing a little bit of depth along with my full sun. And you can do that with your full sun license, I believe. You can have a hoop with no power and still pull some tarps. So there's a way to produce high quality and even chase that mixed light look without using all the lights and the bullshit. But we have to create this supportive environment and make sense out of it. The greenhouse suppliers and people that you go to for a lot of info don't grow plants, and they push a lot of a product and equipment. They don't run their own greenhouses and things, and so I'm not trying to slide them, but the info that they give out is a little bit different here, there, one company. You know, it's like, what the fuck do we listen to sometimes? It gets kind of crazy. So I definitely would say if you're going out on your own and trying to tickle with some of this shit, come over to the booth and talk to me, and we can kind of streamline some of the thoughts that you're going through. If anybody has any questions while we're here real quick, I mean, I'm happy to hit some of the questions. A lot of the stuff I've learned has come from the Emerald Triangle. Again, I was managing a greenhouse company for 11 years, and I've been on my own for 3 now. And so a lot of the information that I have, like I said, is summertime growing cannabis in greenhouses. Those phrases don't go, a lot of people go, wait, what? Because greenhouses were made for wintertime. I just always have to remind people that greenhouses were made for wintertime. It doesn't mean don't use a greenhouse, but it means realize how the greenhouse works and how we're trying to grow these plants. And that about sums it up. Like I said, if anybody has any questions or wants a card, all my stuff's back here on the table. And thanks again.
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool, perfect. 16 minutes.
Thank you, brother.